Hello everyone. This week we're moving on to consider the last of what are called the Hachidaishu. That is, the first 8 imperial anthologies of Waka poetry, which in many respects form the core of the canon of court Waka. The anthology I'm going to discuss today is the Shinkokinshū, the new collection of poetry, ancient and modern. The name is significant, as we shall see shortly. The anthology was commissioned by Emperor Go-Toba and compiled by a team of poets, of whom Fujiwara no Teika is the most famous. The anthology marks a turning point in Waka development, as it was the last anthology produced, which was substantially the product of the court nobility and imperial house, largely free from other influences. It was also the last anthology produced which is at least partially free of the factionalism which was to dominate the world of Waka later. Nevertheless, there are already signs, both in the process of its compilation and production and in its contents, of how Waka was going to develop in the future. The anthology thus occupies a liminal position, both reflecting the glories of the tradition which had produced it, as well as foreshadowing what Waka was to become. It's for these reasons that it's the anthology which has been most comprehensively studied after Kokinshu, and so all I'm going to be able to do in the time that I have available is provide a few brief pointers about it. Shinkokinshū is perhaps the anthology whose compilation was most intimately connected to and influenced by the political circumstances prior to and during the period it was being put together. So I'm going to talk about these first. Then I'll discuss its contents and key poetic features. Let's get started. The world which gave rise to Shinkokinshū was very different from that which produced its illustrious predecessor, Kokinshu. To give a full account of the complex political, social, cultural and religious changes which took place in Japan between the early 10th and early 13th centuries would require a complete series of lectures in its own right, so I'm just going to limit myself to talking about some of the key features which have a bearing on Shinkokinshū's production. First of all, political power was significantly more diffuse at the end of the 12th century. To some extent, the story of the Heian period is the story of a loss of imperial power, its partial reclamation, and its loss again. At the beginning of the period, emperors largely ruled as well as reigned. That is, they controlled the government and government appointments, and positions had real authority. From the beginning of the 11th century, however, as a result of Fujiwara marriage politics, senior government positions, as well as emperors themselves, became almost the exclusive preserve of the Fujiwara house. That is, emperors tended to be born to Fujiwara mothers, take the throne in early childhood, and be dominated by their maternal relatives through kinship ties. While positions in the imperial government were still sought after for the status they brought, they were frequently positions in name only, and real authority and control was exercised via the Fujiwara family's own internal governmental structures. Emperors would frequently abdicate at a relatively young age and live for years in retirement. Eventually, the imperial family was able to use this to its advantage and institute a system of government by retired emperors, which is called insei in Japanese, or cloistered rule. The system was to endure until the end of the Heian period, with some modifications and a gradual loss of authority. The imperial house was able to do this after a weakening of the Fujiwara family's control as a result of a lack of daughters who could be married into it, resulting in candidates taking the throne who lacked maternal links with the Fujiwara. Essentially, under insei, a retired emperor would take over the role which had previously been filled by a Fujiwara maternal grandfather, and dominate an infant emperor that way. The insei system is generally considered to have been instituted by Emperor Go-Sanjo in the late 1060s, although it was his successor, Emperor Shirakawa, who brought it to fruition. It led to the development of alternative court and government structures centred around retired sovereigns, through which political authority and control was organised, leading to a further diffusion of governmental power. Thus, there was the official court and government centred around the reigning emperor, which lacked authority but had immense and enduring prestige and status. To this was added the Fujiwara internal government structures, which retained some power due to their long history and the family's undoubted economic clout, and then finally the cloistered sovereigns' courts, of which there were sometimes more than one, and thus had varying degrees of authority. The system was inherently unstable because the existence of competing cloistered sovereigns' courts meant there would almost inevitably be competition between different branches of the imperial family over who supplied the next emperor, and with him the associated prestige and status. If you want to know more about cloistered rule, then I can recommend Cameron Hirst's book, Insei, Abdicated Sovereigns in the Politics of Late Heian Japan, 1086 to 1185, which is a little on the old side now, but still a valuable and detailed study. In any case, sooner or later, one of these competing courts was going to seek outside assistance to support their candidate's claim to the throne, and this is indeed what happened, when rivalry between Emperor Go-Shirakawa and his son, Emperor Nijo, led to the former seeking support from the warrior Taira clan. Under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, the Taira exploited these imperial divisions to gain positions in the court, culminating in Kiyomori arranging the marriage of his daughter, Tokuko, to the then Emperor Takakura. This led to the birth of a son, Prince Tokihito, in 1178, following which Kiyomori cemented his family's position, forcing potential and actual rivals from government posts and filling them with Taira supporters. The following year, Takakura was forced to abdicate, and the infant Tokihito took the throne as Emperor Antoku. While it was a bit more direct and bloodier, Kiyomori's strategy was essentially no different from that which had been pursued by the Fujiwara and by the imperial family themselves. That is, marry into the imperial family and get a grandson declared crown prince and then emperor. This was a new age, however, and disgruntled members of the imperial family found a ready source of support in the Taira's long-standing rivals, the Minamoto. This rivalry led to the outbreak of the Genpei War between the two warrior clans in 1180, with the conflict ending in 1185 with total victory for the Minamoto and the annihilation of the Taira at the Battle of Dan no Ura, where Antoku was drowned. This conflict is chronicled in the first and greatest of Japan's war tales, Gunki Monogatari, Heike Monogatari, Tale of the Taira Family. There are two full translations of this work into English, a prose one by Helen McCulloch and a verse one by Royal Tyler, which both have their own strengths, and I recommend reading one or both for more insight into how the conflict was seen soon after it had occurred. The work was often chanted to audiences by itinerant Buddhist monks, biwa hoshi, which is why it's feasible to render it into verse. There's even a very famous ghost story, Mimi Nashi Hoichi, about one such blind monk who is summoned to perform before an unknown audience. It turns out the audience are the ghosts of the drowned Taira, who are moved to hear the story of their noble defeat, and things do not go well for Hoichi as a result of his brush with the world of the dead. If you want to find out what happens, there's a lush dramatisation of the story in the portmanteau ghost film, Kwaidan. In any case, 2 years before the end of the war, in 1183, Go-Shirakawa had taken the opportunity of the Taira fleeing Kyoto, along with the infant Antoku, to name his grandson, Takanari, who was then only 3 years old, himself emperor, and the boy duly took the throne under the name of Gotoba. Gotoba remained on the throne until 1198, when he abdicated himself at the age of 18 and took up the role of cloistered emperor, at which point he was eager to find ways of bolstering his authority and that of the court in the new post-Genpei age. Although nobody at the time knew it, the Minamoto's victory in 1185 marked the end of the Heian period and inaugurated almost 700 years of rule, in one form or another, of Japan by warriors, the samurai. At this time, however, the nobility largely saw the end of the Genpei War as an opportunity for a return to business as usual. That is, an end to warriors interfering by obtaining positions in the government, and an opportunity for competition to continue between different branches of the imperial family and various noble houses for control over the throne and the authority this brought. It's this political and social situation which functioned as a crucible for developments in the field of Waka at the end of the 12th century. In particular, Gotoba was motivated to commission a new imperial anthology of poetry as a way of indicating his primacy over the various branches of his own family and other factions at court. Quite apart from its literary character, therefore, Shinkokinshū is an example of politics by proxy, just like Kokinshū was, although in a more chaotic age. The world of Waka at this time, however, was significantly more divided than it had been at the beginning of the 10th century, and that is what I'm going to talk about next. One might have thought that a period of civil war and violent political conflict would not be conducive to poetic activities, but in fact the opposite was the case. Throughout the period of the Taira ascendancy and the war itself, we see an increasing number of small-scale poetic events taking place in the capital. This is because for lower-ranking members of the nobility and clergy, who were the most active poets, the war was almost incidental to their lives. They were not directly involved in it themselves, nor were they likely to be physically harmed except by accident. So, for this group of people, then, poetic activities was something of a refuge from unpalatable reality, and a way of turning one's back on the brutalities of the world and focusing on something more pleasant. Given the war and other circumstances, however, it was not possible to put on large-scale public poetry events, and so matches and meetings at this time tended to be both small-scale and private, and involve only the organisers' friends and intimates. This had the effect of hastening the development of poetic schools and factions, which had differing ideas about what made good and bad poetry. It was not until after the war that circumstances allowed the holding of large-scale public poetry events, the first of which was the poetry and contest in 600 rounds, Ropyakuban Utawase, held in 1193-94, which I discussed last week. I mentioned at that time that the contest contained participants from two poetic schools, the Rokujo conservatives and the Miko Hidari modernisers. But what was the nature of a poetic school at this time? This is a complex question, but simply put, the business of poetic schools was the transmission of poetic knowledge through the generations, most usually along hereditary lines. The Rokujo school, for example, was founded by Fujiwara no Akisue, who trained his third son, Akisuke, in the art of Waka and passed the family's poetic legacy down to him. In turn, Akisuke passed this on to his own son, Kyosuke, and via him to several of his brothers, who formed the core of the Rokujo school in the 1190s. The Miko Hidari school had a somewhat longer history, being nominally founded by Fujiwara no Nagaie, but it was not until his grandson Toshinari, better known as Shunzei, formed a master-pupil relationship with another famous poet, Fujiwara no Mototoshi, in 1138, that the Miko Hidari became firmly established. Konishi Jinichi suggests that this master-pupil relationship involved the transmission of poetic traditions, ways for the composition of poetry, and knowledge of which manuscripts of earlier poetic texts were the most reliable. This demonstrates the common belief among poets of the time that the best of Waka could be found in the past, and thus it was of crucial importance that the knowledge of the past should be passed down the generations for Waka to continue to flourish in the future. Hence, the business of poetic schools being the preservation and transmission of this sort of knowledge. While the preference was certainly for this knowledge to be passed down within a family line, this was not always possible. Mototoshi's relationship with Shunzei is a case in point. He lacked any descendants who had sufficient talent for the composition of poetry for it to be worth his while passing on his poetic knowledge to them, and so he had little choice, if he wanted to see his legacy preserved, but to form a relationship with the prodigiously talented young Shunzei. Shunzei himself was blessed with an even more talented son, Sadaiie, or Teika, who was one of the single most talented and influential figures in all of pre-modern Japanese literature. In turn, he was able to pass on his poetic legacy to his son, Tameiie. Tameiie himself had three sons, Tameuji, Tamenori, and Tamesuke, who quarrelled over their father's legacy, both poetic and material, resulting in their founding rival poetic houses, conflict between which was to shape the subsequent development of Waka. That, though, is something I'm going to put aside until the next video. Getting back to the poetic situation in Kyoto in the early 1190s, after the poetry contest in 600 rounds, factionalism asserted itself with a vengeance, and publicly at least, Waka was dominated by the conservative Rokujo house. And this was partly the result of political manoeuvrings at court, in that Fujiwara Kujo no Yoshitsune, who had sponsored that contest, spent the years 1195 to 1199 under house arrest, for reasons I won't go into at the moment. Shorn of a powerful patron, this put the Miko Hidari poets on the back foot and the Rokujo poets in the ascendant, and it was not until Gotoba abdicated and took on the role of retired emperor that things began to look up, with Yoshitsune's release from confinement. Although, even here, there were reversals and changes of fortune. For example, in 1200 he sponsored another contest involving both Rokujo and Miko Hidari poets, at which Teika was heavily criticised by Fujiwara no Suetsune, who was acting as judge. Teika flew into a rage and vowed in a public letter never to again participate in a contest judged by such a charlatan. Suetsune was able to use this intemperate display as a pretext to have Yoshitsune confined again as a result of his close associates' bad behaviour. Nevertheless, it may well have been events and situations like this which demonstrated to Gotoba the impact that poetic matters could have, and suggested to him that he could leverage control over poetic events to assert himself politically. This perhaps makes it sound as if he was only instrumentally interested in poetry, which was not the case. But it is certainly true that he was politically and socially astute enough to see the benefits which being actively involved in poetry would bring. The result was his sponsorship of an increasing number of poetry events, beginning in 1201, which was also the year in which he re-established the poetry office, Waka, at the palace, to provide a physical location for the consideration of and compilation of poetry. Simultaneously, this had the effect of wresting public control of the poetic discourse from the divided professional poets and their sponsors and vesting it in himself. The result was an increasing number of poetry events, based at the palace, and which involved an increasingly wide circle of poetically active individuals. Robert Huey argues that this seemed aimed at de-emphasising schools and individuals and creating a cultural consensus. In the polarised poetic world of the time, only someone with the status and authority of an emperor or retired emperor would have been able to do this. Even so, when he did hold events during this period, Gotoba was careful to balance participation by both Miko Hidari and Rokujo poets, just as he was by younger and older ones, and to some extent male and female poets too, in order to be as inclusive as possible. It seems likely that at this time he had already decided to commission a new imperial anthology, a decision which was made clear by his holding of the mammoth poetry contest in 1500 rounds, Sengo Hyakuban Utawase, in 1201. Like the earlier poetry contest in 600 rounds, this was a hyakushu awase, but on a larger scale, where 30 poets were asked to compose 100 poems on 100 topics. The resultant 3,000 poems were organised into rounds and judged by 10 well-known poets, including Gotoba himself, as you can see here. You'll note that poor old Kensho, who came off so badly in the poetry contest in 600 rounds at Shunzei's hands, was given the task of judging the majority of this contest's love poems. Given his temperament and poetic preferences, this is an unusual choice to say the least. Ariyoshi Tamotsu, the Japanese scholar who has studied Sengo Hyakuban Utawase in most depth, describes it as a cruel joke at his expense. So it seems that Gotoba may have been not so subtly ridiculing the earnest and pedantic monk, and thus indicating the way he expected the judgments to go. On the other hand, Gotoba was careful to balance the proportions of judges associated with each poetic house, as you can see here. There were 3 Miko Hidari judges, 3 Rokujo ones, and 4 neutral, or perhaps non-aligned might be a better term, poets. Broadly speaking, the results were a convincing win for Miko Hidari poets, with even the Rokujo judges tending to award victories to them when their work was directly compared with that by their Rokujo ones. Interestingly enough, though, Shunzei and Teika, the Miko Hidari standard bearers, are the most even-handed of the judges, awarding a larger proportion of wins to Rokujo poets than many of the others. Thus, it's a little difficult to know what to say about the poetry contest in 1500 rounds. On the one hand, as a collection of poetry, parts of it can be quite tedious because there are a significant number of conventional poems on standard topics, while any sense of progression that there may have been within individual poets' hyakushu is destroyed by the division into rounds, although this is clearly a criticism which could be levelled at Ropyakuban Utawase as well. On the other hand, as a work demonstrating the range of views about poetry present in Japan at the very beginning of the 13th century, Sengo Hyakuban Utawase has no equal. This is because of the range of judges and the way in which they express their opinions. Some provide standard judgments, either as short comments or longer discussions, while others take the opportunity to provide judgments in literary form, either as Chinese poems or as waka. Gotoba, for example, writes his judgments as acrostic waka, where the first syllable of each line spells out whether the round is won or tied. Of all the judges, Kensho is the most likely to award a win or a loss to a round rather than a tie. He is also the only judge to significantly favour Rokujo-style conservative poems over the more modern Miko Hidari ones. In any case, as I have just said, the overall result was a clear win for the Miko Hidari modern poets over the Rokujo conservatives. On the question of why this was the case, I think it's worth quoting what Robert Huey has to say. Surely one reason was that much of the factionalism was, in fact, purely political, and there was more agreement on aesthetic issues than the various camps would admit. These were, after all, serious poets. A good poem is a good poem and can transcend rules or styles. In any case, victory for the Miko Hidari in Sengo Hyakuban Utawase was a clear indication that this was the style which would be taken forward into the new anthology. As well as the poetry contest in 1500 rounds, all of Gotoba's other poetry events, over 20 of them between 1200 and 1205, served to create a great repository of contemporaneous poetry which could be drawn upon for inclusion in the new anthology. The initial selection was presented to Gotoba in 1203, and a formal banquet to celebrate the new anthology was held in 1205, largely because this was the 300th anniversary of Kokinshū's completion. But work continued on the draft, adding, removing and reordering poems until about 1216. Taker, in fact, was so irritated by Gotoba's insistence on holding a presentation banquet in 1205 that he refused to attend, which was a harbinger of the conflict that was to arise between the poet and his patron in later years. But, as they say, that's another story. Shinkokinshū follows the same 20-book pattern of prior anthologies, as you can see here, although some topics have been omitted and others, most notably Shinto and Buddhist-themed poems, have been added. It's still clear, though, that the anthology is dominated by poems on the seasons and love, placed as they are at the beginning of each half of the work. This is even clearer if we look at the numbers of poems by topic. As you can see, the combined total of seasonal poems is 696, or just over 35% of the total number of poems in the anthology. Love, with 445 poems, composes just under 22.5%, while Miscellaneous, with 417 poems, is just over 21%. By contrast, the percentage figures for Kokinshū are 33% for seasonal poems and just under that for Love, and 12.5% for Miscellaneous. So it's clear there was both a reduction in the importance placed on love poetry and an increase in that of miscellaneous poems. The reasons for this should be, I hope, clear if you think about them. As the composition of poetry had become more of a literary exercise and less of a social activity, fewer love poems were being produced, and thus the compilers had a smaller number of good love poems to choose from. In addition, I think it likely, although this is not something I've examined in detail, that a large number of the miscellaneous poems in Shinkokinshū will be older ones, composed when there was a less rigid idea of what the core meaning of a topic should be. Here is the complete list of the anthology's major poets, that is, poets who have more than 10 poems included within it. Some of the names will, I hope, be familiar to you, as I will have talked about them in relation to the poetry of earlier periods. I've also marked those poets who are women, so you can see the proportion compared to male poets. For the vast majority of these, you can find brief biographical details for them online, or for all of them in the appendix to Laurel Rod's Shinkokinshū translation. But what exactly is the contribution that different periods make to the anthology's contents? Take a look at this. Essentially, these major poets break down into 5 main groupings. Very early poets, meaning people from the Nara up to the early Kokinshū period in the early 10th century. These are then followed by mid to late 10th century poets. Next, there is a slightly smaller group of 11th century poets and a significantly larger one of early 12th century ones. Finally, there's a large group of late 12th or even early 13th century poets, with an increasing number of them falling into the periods closest to when the anthology was put together. In percentage terms, these are as you can see here. Obviously, these figures don't add up to 100 because they only account for the contributions of major named poets, but they are instructive, I think, and show that 40% of Shinkokinshū's contents were provided by named 12th century poets. Again, perhaps this is unsurprising in that it is poets from this period who would have been composing work which most reflected the contemporaneous views of what good poetry was, and so had a better chance of having their work being considered to be of high quality. There's one more point to mention. Let's look back at the best represented poets. All of those poets whom I have bold-faced and asterisked were associated with the Miko Hidari house. Saigyo was the single most famous poet of the generation immediately preceding the compilation of Shinkokinshū, while Princess Shokushi was the premier woman poet of her generation, as well as a pupil of Shunzei's, to say nothing of her role as a member of the imperial house. Gotoba, of course, commissioned the anthology, but was a talented poet in his own right, and had a definite preference for more modern poetic styles. Jien, too, while not formally associated with the Miko Hidari, was a close associate of Yoshitsune's, and so could be linked to that group of poets. Taken all together, these poets' works account for 27% of the anthology's total contents, and thus demonstrate that there was a clear victory for Miko Hidari-style modern poetry in putting it together. But what was this poetry like, and what are the anthology's organisational principles? Well, it's not going too far to say that in Shinkokinshū the principles of association and progression, which have been a feature to a greater or lesser extent of the structuring and ordering of individual poems in anthologies ever since Kokinshū times, reached their apogee. This was a further way in which the anthology both reflects prior developments and looks forward to what was going to happen in the world of Waka in the future. Since the beginning of the 12th century, one of the primary compositional exercises for Waka poets had been the 100-poem sequence, or hyakushu. In this, poets would compose 100 poems on 100 discrete topics, often following through the general pattern of an imperial anthology, with a sequence of poems on the seasons followed by those on love and or miscellaneous topics. A good 100-poem sequence not only showed attention to producing poems which fit properly with the assigned topics, but also showed a progression and linkage between the individual poems in the sequence, making it more of a unified whole. These 100-poem sequences often became the building blocks for larger poetic events, such as poetry contests, with both the poetry contest in 600 rounds and the poetry contest in 1500 rounds being cases in point. Thus, with 100 years or more of such careful attention to progression and association between poems being part of much Waka practice, it's not surprising that it should come to take centre stage in an imperial anthology. Shinkokinshū's principles of association and progression were eventually to lead to the abandonment of Waka altogether and the development of the new verse form of Renga, or linked verse, in the 14th century, but that's something I'll discuss in a later video. Let's take a look at a short sequence of poems from Shinkokinshū to see how these principles of association and progression worked in practice. These are winter poems taken from Book 6 of the anthology, and I must confess to having taken the analysis of the progression here from Brower and Miner's Japanese court poetry, so I strongly suggest taking a look there for a bit more detail. On the sound of snow in the middle of the night. Ake yaranu nezame no toko ni kikoyu nari. Magaki no take no yuki no shitaore. No hint of dawn, yet awakened in my bed, I hear it. Bamboo against the lattice fence, boughs breaking in the snow. The time in which this poem is set is night, before dawn, while the speaker is still lying in his bed. He can see nothing, and only hears the effect of the snow, weighing down the bamboo and breaking it. The primary imagery, if you can call it that, is sound. This is followed by composed when the gentlemen of the court were composing in the conception of yearning after mountain snow just before dawn. Oto wa yama sayaka ni miyuru shirayuki o akenu to tsuguru tori no koe kana. Mount Ottawa appears clearly, snow's whiteness brightening, announced by the cock's crow. The time here moves forward to dawn, while the rising sun brings some aspects of the world outside into view, suggesting a broadening of perspective and also that the speaker has got up and is looking at the mountains outside. The sound imagery of the prior poem is developed through the use of the utamakura, Mount Ottawa, which contains the word oto, sound, and this is then reinforced by the cock's crow at the end of the poem. Next comes seeing the first snows lying upon the fallen autumn leaves, he sent this to a lady-in-waiting at the Jotomon Palace. Yamazato wa michi mo yamiezu narinuran, momiji to tomo ni yuki no furinuru. To your mountain home the path is now impassable, I think. Along with autumn leaves, the snow has started falling. Although the time is not explicitly stated here, it can be inferred to be daytime. From the broad perspective of distant mountains, the perspective now concentrates upon a particular village, although this exists purely in the speaker's imagination. He cannot see it from where he is, but he's imagining what the weather conditions are like there. The reference to mountains here forms a direct link with the previous poem's reference to Mount Ottawa. The next poem is composed on snow upon a lodge in the fields. Sabishisa o ika ni sei o tote okabe naru, naro no hashidari yuki no furu ran. For this loneliness, what is there to do? Upon the hillside, the oak leaves are in tatters. From the snow, no doubt. This poem too can be inferred to be set during the day, and is thus set at the same time as the prior one, but there is a shift in perspective again, from mountains to hillside. It's linked to the prior poem through both works' use of the image of leaves, the generic reference to autumn leaves, followed by oak leaves here. Next comes when he presented a 100-poem sequence. Koma tomete sode uchihara o kage mo nashi, sano no watari no yuki no yugure. Halting my mount to brush clear my sleeves, I cast no shadow at the ford of Sano, snow falling in the evening. The time moves forward again to evening, and the location shifts again to Sano, which is located on flatland. There's further playing with perspective. From Sano, one would expect to have a good view of the surrounding countryside, but the snow is preventing him seeing very far. While, for the first time in this sequence, there's not a direct link with the prior poem in terms of imagery, the progression, hillside to plain, makes the sequencing more apparent. Next comes when the regent and grand minister was a major councillor, he had this composed on snow upon a mountain hut. Matsuhito no fumoto no michi wa taenu ran, nokiba no sugi ni yuki o moru nari. Awaiting one whose path among the foothills has vanished, I think, the cedar by my eaves is buried deep in snow. The time continues to be evening in this poem, as this is the time of day when a lady might be waiting for a man to call. So this is a further shift in perspective, from the man who was awoken and wondered if the weather is going to keep him from being able to visit his lady in her mountain village, to the lady herself, wondering if he is going to arrive. She's gazing out from her house to the foothills, so the distance shifts again, while there's an imagistic contrast with the previous poem where the man is outside to this one with the woman in her house. Finally, we have in the same house when he had winter poems composed containing place names. This was composed on snow on the estate of Fushimi. Yume kaya o michi sae taenu kuretake no Fushimi no sato no yuki no shita ore. In dreams I trod a path now gone. The bamboo at Fushimi is broken in the snow. The time returns to night, as does the speaker of the poem to bed. The external view is reduced to that of the speaker's dreams, which in turn suggests that the whole prior sequence has not been an actual journey at all, but one which has existed only in the poet's dreams. The snow imagery is reinforced and intensified again. In the prior poem it had been enough to bury a cedar tree, while now it is enough to break the bamboo again. So, to sum up the progressions in this sequence of poems, there is a temporal progression through a 24-hour period, a locational progression from a house to outside and back again, variations in the view available to the poet's speakers, and a series of imagistic links tying them together. There's also an intermittent use of utamakura, Mount Ottawa, Sano and Fushimi, as a form of punctuation to set off individual poems. In addition, although it's not necessarily apparent from the translations, the poems earlier in the sequence are older ones, so it moves forward in time towards compositions by poets, Sada-ie, Teika and Ari-ie, who were contemporaneous with the anthology's compilation. Finally, it's also the case that Teika's poem mentioning Sano and Ari-ie's on Fushimi are generally considered to be among their best works, so there's a further build-up of literary quality as the sequence moves forward. I hope that this demonstrates the complexity of Shinkokinshū's achievement and the level of attention that must have gone into actually choosing the poems and putting them together. Perhaps it's no surprise that it took 15 or more years to arrive at the version we have today. Even that, though, is not the complete end of the story. In 1221, Go-Toba abandoned poetry for politics and attempted to overthrow the Kamakura shogunate and restore imperial rule. The attempt was a failure, and he was exiled to the island of Oki, located just under 100 kilometers north of Matsue on the coast of the southern part of Japan's main island, Honshu. Go-Toba was to live there for the remainder of his life, 19 years, and pass his time largely in poetic pursuits. I've done a complete translation of a famous 100-poem sequence he composed there, Ento on Hyakushu, His Majesty's 100 Poems from a Distant Isle, which is available from all good Kindle bookstores. One of his other projects, though, was further work on Shinkokinshū, attempting to reorder and re-edit it to further produce a version which more completely matched his vision. It's not the one used today, but it just goes to show that the work of Waka is never-ending. I hope that this brief discussion of Shinkokinshū has given you a new appreciation of that anthology's contents and an understanding of the environment which shaped its production. As ever, if you have any questions about anything I've said, feel free to ask me. See you soon.